The wind came down the canyon like it had a grudge. It howled low and mean, slicing through Gideon Blake's canvas coat, tearing at the seams like fingers trying to rip him apart. Snow blew sideways, biting into his cheeks, stinging like grit, and even his horse, Boone, snorted with unease beneath him. He'd seen bad storms in his 39 winters, but this one felt personal. The trail ahead was gone, swallowed whole by white. Pines, rocks, fence posts, all vanished behind a veil of cold rage. His boots were already soaked through, numb. Every creak of the saddle was a warning: turn back, find cover, wait it out. But turning back meant riding blind into mountains he didn't trust. Forward, at least, followed the edge of the ravine. If he stayed close to the slope, he had a chance of finding the ridge that would take him home. He squinted into the swirling white, lips cracked and jaw clenched tight. That's when he saw it. No, her. A figure slumped against a rock, barely a shape in the snow. For a moment, he thought it was a deer, maybe a lost calf. But the closer he got, the more the shape curled into itself. Human. Small. Arms drawn tight to the chest. Long, dark hair frozen to her face. He pulled Boone to a halt. A girl. Alone. And native, by the looks of her. Everything he'd ever been told screamed in his head. Leave it alone, Blake. Ride on. Don't get involved. Apache territory was no place for misplaced charity. Helping the wrong person could cost you more than your supplies. It could cost your life. But the girl wasn't moving, not even shivering, just still. Still like something that had stopped breathing. Gideon blinked away snow from his lashes and swung down off the saddle. His boots sank ankle-deep, then knee-deep, crunching through powder that clung like glue. The cold cut through every layer he wore. He could feel the sweat freeze on his back as he pulled his pack open and unrolled the heavy wool blanket. It was the last real thing he had from his mother, thick and sturdy, hand-woven in soft grey and sky-blue threads. She'd made it back when he was 17, told him it would keep him warm long after she was gone. And it had. Until now. He knelt beside the girl, her breathing shallow, lips nearly blue. Her skin looked grey under the frost. Her coat was thin, little more than a shell. No gloves, no boots. Gideon didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. He just wrapped the blanket around her, tucking it beneath her legs, over her shoulders, pulling it snug like he used to do with calves born too early in spring. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, deep, afraid. She didn't speak, but her fingers clutched at the blanket like she understood exactly what it was. Life. "It's okay," he said, voice rough, breath curling in the air between them. "You're going to be all right." She stared at him, then looked at the blanket, back at him. Not fear, not yet, but something close, a question, a warning. Gideon stood, scanned the ridge. The wind had slowed, not much, but enough. Behind a crooked bend in the rocks, a small hollow offered some shelter from the worst of it. He helped her to her feet. She stumbled, nearly fell, and he caught her by the elbow, shocked at how light she was, how fragile. They didn't speak again as he led her through the drifts. She walked barefoot, her legs stiff, movements jerky like a puppet with tangled strings. They huddled in the hollow, and he built a fire from half-frozen kindling. Smoke fought to rise, then gave in. The flame hissed but held. He shared his last 2 strips of jerky and half a biscuit. When she ate, she didn't chew. She savoured, slow and cautious. Finally, she pointed to herself and said, "Nessa." Her voice was soft, hoarse, like it hadn't been used in days. Gideon nodded. "Gideon." She repeated it, carefully. "Guide on." They sat that way for hours, neither quite sure what to make of the other. She watched him, the way animals watched fire, entranced, uncertain, deeply aware it could burn. As the storm wore itself out, Gideon let himself rest for a moment. He didn't sleep, just stared into the flames and thought about how strange it all was. The timing, the place, the way her eyes kept finding his. By dawn, the wind had died. Pale gold lit the tops of the snow-covered pines, and the storm had moved on, leaving silence behind. Nessa stood slowly, steadier now. She pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders, then stepped toward him, arms extended. She tried to give it back. "No," he said, holding up a hand. "Keep it." She frowned, then said something in Apache, the tone urgent, gesturing between the blanket and her chest, then pointing at him, again and again. He didn't understand, not the words, but he caught the feeling. Panic. "No," he repeated. "It's a gift, that's all." She stared at him. Desperation flickered across her face. She pressed the blanket against his chest. He shook his head and turned toward Boone. "You keep warm now, Nessa. Stay out of the wind." Then he mounted up and rode away, never looking back. But as he disappeared into the trees, Nessa stood frozen, the blanket still clutched around her. Because in her world, what Gideon had done meant something very different. And by nightfall, others would come looking for answers. The trading post came into view just after midday. It sat low in the valley like it had been carved out of the mountain itself. Stone walls, timber roof, and a curl of smoke rising from the crooked chimney. Gideon Blake rode in slow, his legs stiff in the saddle, his breath misting in front of him. The storm still clung to his coat, and the cold had worked its way into his bones, but it wasn't the weather that unsettled him now. It was the girl, Nessa. She hadn't said much, only her name, but it had been enough to stick. He couldn't shake the look in her eyes when he refused the blanket back. She hadn't looked grateful. She'd looked worried, like she was trying to warn him of something he couldn't quite hear. And the way she'd clutched that blanket, not just for warmth, for meaning. Gideon rubbed a hand down his jaw, the stubble crusted with frost. He didn't believe in omens, but something about the encounter kept tugging at his gut like a fishhook. Inside the post, warmth hit him like a slap. The stove in the corner roared hot, and the thick stink of tobacco and sweat filled the air. 3 men sat around a scarred poker table, their faces pink with drink. The oldest of them, Ben Mallory, lifted his eyes from a stack of cards. "Well, I'll be damned," Mallory grunted. "Gideon Blake, I figured you were frozen stiff somewhere by now." Gideon shrugged off his coat. "Wasn't far from it." "Storm that bad?" one of the card players asked, a twitchy younger man with a scar cutting through his jaw like a blade. "Bad enough," Gideon muttered. He didn't want conversation. He wanted warmth, coffee, and maybe a minute to forget about a girl with snow in her lashes. Mallory poured from a dented tin pot. "Santa Fe business still callin'?" Gideon nodded, taking the cup. "Deadlines don't care about the weather." "Nor do the Apache," the scarred man said with a dark chuckle. "You hear the drums last night?" Gideon froze mid-sip. "Drums?" He shook his head slowly. "Can't say I did." "They've been up in the hills," Mallory said, voice quieter now. "Last few nights, steady beat. Too far to see 'em, but close enough to feel it in your teeth." "Means they're moving," the scarred man added. "Looking for something." Or someone, Gideon thought, but didn't say it. He sat at the edge of the room, letting the fire thaw the stiffness from his hands. Outside, the wind had gone still. A strange hush settled in the valley, heavy as snow. No bird calls, no rustling trees. Even the horses in the stables were quiet. It wasn't peace. It was a pause. A waiting. That night, Sleep didn't come easy. Gideon lay on a cot in the back room, staring at the warped ceiling beams. Every creak of the wood made him reach for the knife at his belt. Every gust of wind against the shutters made his breath catch. Then came the sound. Faint at first. Rhythmic. Thump, thump, thump. He sat up slowly, holding his breath. Not thunder, not hoofbeats. Drums. Low, steady, ancient, like the heartbeat of something older than the land itself. He stepped outside, boots crunching the frost-hardened dirt. The stars had returned, scattered like spilled salt across the sky. But between the trees, the dark felt alive. The kind of alive that watches. The kind that waits. "Something out there," Mallory said behind him, his voice low. "Been feeling it all night." "You see anything?" "No." He tightened his grip on the rifle in his arms. "But I can feel it." Gideon did too, like eyes pressing against his back. Not one pair. Dozens. Then silence, sudden, like the drums had been swallowed whole. No echo, no fade, just gone. Gideon didn't sleep after that. He sat on the edge of the cot, cup of cold coffee in his hands, eyes fixed on the door. The silence was louder than the drums had been. It pressed into his chest, into his ribs, made his heart beat too loud in his ears. Come morning, the sky was pale and still. The first sign of them wasn't a sound. It was the horses. Mallory's buckskin gelding reared up in the paddock, eyes rolling white. The others followed, snorting, stomping, ears flat. Then Boone whinnied, loud and sharp. Gideon rushed outside. 7 riders had emerged from the trees without a sound. They sat their horses like statues, dark-haired, stone-faced, painted in red and black war colors. No shouting, no charging, just there, blocking the trail. Gideon's mouth went dry. He counted the riders, then froze on the last one. The girl, Nessa. She sat behind an older man, her body wrapped in the blanket he had given her, his mother's blanket. She met his eyes and didn't look away. Gideon stepped down from the porch slowly, hands open. He didn't reach for his rifle, didn't speak. The oldest of the riders, a man with grey streaks in his braids and feathers hanging from his sleeves, raised his hand in a clear command. "Stop." Gideon obeyed. The old man said something in Apache. His voice was deep, deliberate. Nessa translated, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says, 'You claimed me.'" Gideon blinked. "What?" "You gave me your blanket. You saved me. You refused to take it back." Her eyes shone with something he couldn't name. Not anger, not fear, something more ancient. "You claimed me as your wife." Gideon laughed once, sharp and humorless. "I gave you a blanket. You were freezing. To you, it was kindness." She swallowed. "To us, it is a vow." The old man spoke again. Gideon turned to Nessa, his voice tight. "What's he saying now?" Her gaze didn't waver. "He says, if you meant it, you will come with us. Face the trials. Prove your heart. If you didn't, then you have insulted my people. And the insult must be answered." She looked at him, searching his face like she had that night by the fire. "You must choose," she said. "Now." And in the trees behind them, the drums began again. Gideon didn't move at first. The old man's words still hung in the air, sharp and unmoving, like a blade stuck deep in wood. The snow around the horses remained untouched, but the weight of 7 stairs bore down on him as if they had the power to shape the very ground he stood on. His fingers curled instinctively, itching toward the revolver at his belt, but he didn't move for it. Every inch of him understood what a mistake that would be. These men weren't jittery ranch hands or outlaw drifters. They were calm, composed, and deadly. If he so much as twitched the wrong way, he'd never make it to the saddle. Nessa watched him, eyes steady beneath the drape of the blanket. That same damn blanket. It clung to her shoulders like it had always belonged there, and suddenly Gideon felt like he was looking at something sacred, something alive, something he had no right to touch, let alone give away. "I didn't know," he said finally, the words dry in his throat. "That it meant—" "I believe you," she said softly. "But that doesn't change what it means." The man beside her, her grandfather, Gideon guessed, nodded as if that answer had been enough. He spoke again, and Nessa translated with a voice that had grown firmer. "He says intentions matter less than actions. You gave the blanket. You made a vow. Now you must honor it, or reject it, and face the cost." "What kind of cost?" Gideon asked, though he already knew the answer before she opened her mouth. "My people don't believe in loose ends," she said, "or in shame left unresolved." Gideon's eyes drifted to the younger warrior on the far right, a man whose body leaned forward just slightly, his hand resting too comfortably on the hilt of his knife. His eyes were locked on Gideon like he was already imagining how to carve into him. "That one doesn't like me," Gideon muttered. Nessa hesitated. "His name is Talon. He's my cousin. He has asked for my hand more than once." Gideon exhaled through his nose. "Of course he has." Mallory stepped up behind him, rifle in hand, voice low and tense. "You want me to tell them to move along?" "No," Gideon said, barely glancing back. "This isn't your fight." He looked at Nessa. She hadn't looked away once. "What happens if I go with you?" "You come to our village," she said. "You see our ways. You understand the life you would be part of. And then you are given trials." "What kind of trials?" "Ones that test more than your body." She said it like a warning. He looked to the trail behind them, back toward the post, toward his horse, toward the warmth of a life he knew how to live. Then to the path ahead. Thick woods, foreign eyes, a culture he'd never dared to understand. But he'd crossed a line the moment he wrapped that blanket around her. He'd given something away without knowing the price, and it was time to pay. "I'll go," he said. A quiet ripple passed through the group. Not relief, not surprise, just a recognition that a step had been taken, one that couldn't be undone. Her grandfather nodded once, and the warriors turned as one, their horses wheeling into formation without a word. Gideon mounted Boone, following them into the trees. The forest closed around them like a set of jaws. They rode in silence, broken only by the crunch of hooves in the snow and the distant caw of crows overhead. Gideon didn't ask questions. No one offered answers. The woods grew thicker, the air colder, but the pace never slowed. After several hours, the land shifted. What had once been a simple trail opened into a hidden valley tucked between towering red cliffs. Smoke drifted up from cook fires. Small round dwellings made of brush and mud scattered the area, nestled beside a wide stream that glimmered beneath the thinning clouds. The Apache village. It looked peaceful, even beautiful. But the moment they rode in, everything stopped. Children froze mid-play. Women paused at their fires. Men stood from their work. All eyes turned toward Gideon. He felt every one of them like a pin pressed to the skin. Nessa dismounted and moved to walk beside his horse, her shoulders straight, her chin high. But Gideon saw the tension in her spine, the way her fingers dug into the fabric of the blanket. "They weren't told you were coming," she said quietly. "They don't like surprises." "Can't say I'm too fond of them myself," Gideon muttered. She led him to the center of the village, where a large fire pit smouldered low, surrounded by smooth logs arranged in a circle. An older woman stepped from the largest dwelling, her grey hair braided with beads of turquoise, her eyes sharp as broken glass. "She's my grandmother," Nessa said, her voice barely audible now. "Elder Willow." Elder Willow didn't speak to him. She spoke to Nessa, and her voice cut like flint, harsh, accusatory. She gestured at Gideon, at the blanket, at the surrounding villagers who were beginning to gather. "What's she saying?" Gideon asked, though he already had a feeling. Nessa swallowed hard. "She says I've brought shame to our family, that I let myself be claimed by an outsider, that I smell like a stranger now." Her voice trembled. A man shoved his way forward. Not Talon, but someone younger, his face twisted with anger. He barked something sharp, and Gideon didn't need a translator to understand the rage in it. "He says I should be given to him instead," Nessa said, her voice gone flat. "That I'm broken now, and it's your fault." Gideon's jaw clenched. "You want me to hit him, or keep breathing through it?" Nessa didn't answer. The man stepped closer. Too close. But before anyone moved, Elder Willow raised her hand. She looked at Gideon then, for the first time, and she spoke. Slow, steady, final. Nessa turned toward him, her face pale. "She says, you must complete the marriage trials to prove your honor." "And if I don't?" Gideon asked. Nessa's eyes didn't leave his. "Then I must choose someone else," she said, "and you will not leave this valley alive." The circle tightened. The fire cracked, and somewhere deep in the cliffs behind them, the drums began again, faster now, like a warning or a countdown. The sun barely breached the red cliffs by morning, casting long, slanted shadows across the village. Smoke rose in lazy curls from the fires as the people stirred, slow and cautious, like the air itself hadn't decided whether to forgive Gideon Blake for existing. He sat cross-legged near the main fire, still wrapped in his coat. He hadn't slept. Not really. Too many eyes, too much tension, too many unspoken things pressing in from every side. Elder Willow had not spoken to him again. Nessa hadn't either, not since the drums. She'd vanished into one of the smaller dwellings with the other women, and when Gideon tried to follow her with his eyes, someone stepped into his path. Tall, hard-jawed, arms folded. Not Talon, but close enough in build and demeanor that Gideon felt the message loud and clear. "You're not one of us yet. Stay where you are." So he stayed, and he waited. Shortly after dawn, Chief Hollow Thorn emerged. His presence changed the shape of the village. Conversations stilled. Movement paused. Even the dogs went quiet. He walked with deliberate steps toward Gideon, then gestured for him to rise. Gideon stood, bones aching, shoulders stiff from sleeping, half sitting on cold ground. "The trials begin now," Nessa's voice came from behind him. She was dressed differently, her hair tied back tightly, the blanket gone. She wore a woven sash across her chest, marked with a pattern Gideon didn't recognize but knew better than to ignore. "You'll face 3, she continued. "Each drawn from the old ways, strength, wisdom, sacrifice." Gideon nodded. "Sounds fair." "Fair?" she repeated, her expression unreadable. "No, not fair. Necessary." She turned without another word and led him toward the cliffs. They didn't climb a path. There was none. Just jagged, unforgiving stone rising into the sky like broken teeth. The villagers followed in a slow procession, some murmuring to one another, others silent. At the base of the climb, the crowd parted. Hollow Thorn raised a hand and pointed up. High above, a feather swayed in the wind, tied to a post embedded into a narrow outcropping near the top. The feather was golden brown with black tips, long and elegant. An eagle's. "You must retrieve it," Nessa said. "That's it?" "That's the first." Gideon stared at the rocks. They looked dry, brittle. No handholds, No ropes. How high? High enough to matter. He dropped his coat and gloves, scanning the cliff like a map that hadn't been translated. Then, without another word, he stepped forward and began to climb. The first 10 feet were manageable, natural grooves and ledges carved by years of rain and heat. But after that, it turned mean. The rock crumbled under his boots. His fingers scraped against sharp edges. Once, his foot slipped, and for a second, he dangled, breath frozen in his lungs, heart pounding like a drum in his ears. He climbed anyway. Halfway up, a sharp cry echoed above him. A shadow swooped from the cliffs, broad wings, fierce talons, the eagle. It dove once, grazing his shoulder, then circled again. A warning. Of course, Gideon muttered under his breath. Would have been too easy otherwise. He reached the post with shaking arms, fingers numb, lungs burning. The feather danced in the wind, taunting him. He reached for it. The eagle dove again. This time it didn't miss. Its talons raked his arm, tearing cloth and drawing blood. Gideon cursed, grabbing the post for balance. The villagers below gasped. Someone laughed. Talon, probably. He wiped blood on his pants and lunged, snatching the feather before the wind could take it. The climb down was slower. Every muscle screamed. His right arm throbbed with pain. When his boots finally hit dirt, his legs nearly buckled, but he stood straight, held out the feather to Hollow Thorn. The chief nodded once. Respect. Gideon didn't smile. You've passed the first, Nessa said. He looked at her. Her eyes held something new now. Not warmth, but the beginning of it. Recognition. The next trial came at dusk. They brought him to a ring of stones just outside the village. In the center lay a strange wooden object, curved, carved with intricate symbols, circles, birds, arrows, nothing he could decipher. The ancestor stone, Nessa explained. Each side tells a path. Only one is true. The others lead to ruin. Sounds simple, Gideon said. She didn't smile. It isn't. He was to study it, alone. Then choose the right side and explain his reasoning. The villagers gathered around, forming a loose circle. No one spoke. Gideon knelt, staring at the carving. He didn't know the symbols, didn't know the rules, but he studied anyway. One side showed a mountain with a fire on top. Another, a man with a bow. Another, a bird flying high over trees. The last, a blanket, folded, cradled in open hands. His gut stirred. He pointed to the last side. The blanket, he said. It means giving, trust. That's the path forward. Murmurs passed through the crowd. Hollow Thorn stepped forward, knelt, and touched the same side Gideon had chosen. Then he stood. You understand more than you know, Nessa said softly. He looked at her. Did I pass? Yes. He exhaled, shoulders sagging. But she wasn't finished. Tomorrow comes the last trial, she said. And it is the one most men fail. He looked at her, not with fear, but something heavier. What do I have to give up? She didn't answer. Not yet. That night, he sat by the fire alone, bandaged arm resting in his lap, the eagle feather beside him. Children played nearby again. A woman brought him a bowl of stew. Even Talon hadn't stared him down since sunset. But the silence in the air wasn't peace. It was waiting. The third trial was coming. And this time, it wouldn't be about climbing or guessing. It would be about losing something he wasn't sure he could let go. The morning of the final trial arrived without fanfare. No drums, no chants. just a cold breeze curling through the trees and the quiet murmur of villagers starting their day. Gideon sat beside the fire pit, sipping the bitter tea one of the elders had pressed into his hands. His body still ached from the climb, and the cuts from the eagle's talons were stiff beneath fresh bandages, but the pain wasn't what kept his shoulders tense and his stomach coiled tight. It was not knowing what would be asked of him next. He'd faced danger before, weather, beasts, men with guns and nothing to lose, but this was different. This wasn't just survival, this was belonging. Nessa approached just after sunrise. She didn't wear the sash this time. Her dark hair was braided in a single long line down her back, and her face was calm, unreadable. "It's time," she said. He stood, brushing dirt from his coat. "What now? More climbing? Another riddle?" "No," she said. "Today, you must choose what part of yourself you're willing to leave behind." He frowned. "That's a little vague, don't you think?" She tilted her head slightly, almost amused. "It's meant to be." They walked together to the edge of the village where the trees grew tall and close. A trail wound through the pines, barely marked, and she led him down it in silence. The deeper they went, the quieter everything became. No birdsong, no rustling branches. Just the soft crunch of boots and moccasins over fallen needles. At last, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a small wooden platform, no higher than his waist. Upon it sat a shallow clay bowl and a long ceremonial knife, its handle carved with eagle feathers and fire symbols. Gideon looked at it, then at Nessa. "This your idea of sacrifice?" he asked. "I'm not much of a bloodletting kind of guy." "No blood," she said, "unless you choose it." "Then what?" Her voice softened. "This is the place where a man must give up something that has shaped him, a piece of the life he clings to, something that has power over him." "Like what?" "A name, a weapon, a memory, a vow, a burden." She stepped closer. "You don't have to tell anyone what it is, but you must place it in the bowl and leave it behind." Gideon swallowed. "And if I don't?" "Then you walk away," she said. "But you do not return to the village, or to me." His eyes fell on the bowl again. It looked so simple, so harmless, but it might as well have been a cliff edge. He turned away, pacing slowly, his boots tracing circles in the dirt. His mind raced. What would he give up? His mother's name? His guilt over the brother he hadn't saved? The quiet rage that had kept him alive all these years? The part of him that still believed he didn't deserve a second chance? It wasn't a question of objects, it was weight. And he had plenty of it. He knelt slowly at the platform, his breath tight in his chest. He looked at the knife, then the bowl, then pulled a small leather pouch from inside his coat. Inside it was a silver ring, worn, scratched, once polished by loving hands, his father's. He'd carried it for 20 years, never wore it, just kept it, a reminder of all the silence, the anger, the absence. He turned it over in his hand, feeling its coolness, its history. His father had taught him how to ride, how to shoot, how to gut a deer, but never how to be a man. That part Gideon had learned the hard way, and in many ways he'd built himself around that absence. He closed his hand around the ring, then opened it, and placed the ring gently in the bowl. For a long time he didn't move. When he stood, he didn't look back. Nessa said nothing as they walked back to the village. But something shifted in the way she walked beside him, closer now, aligned. The village was waiting. Children peeked from doorways. Elders lined the path. Hollow Thorn stood near the fire, arms crossed, face as unreadable as ever. Elder Willow stepped forward, her voice rising above the murmurs. She spoke in Apache, and this time Gideon didn't wait for a translation. He watched her face, the way her eyes shifted from him to Nessa and back again. There was no accusation now, no disgust, only a kind of acceptance. Nessa finally turned to him. "You have passed," she said. "All three." He nodded, unsure what to say. The words stuck in his throat. But Hollow Thorn wasn't finished. The chief raised a hand, and the villagers stepped forward one by one, each placing a stone in a growing circle around the fire. As they did, they spoke words, brief, solemn. Gideon caught phrases, blessings, names, gratitude. He looked to Nessa. "This is the binding," she said. "You are being named, not just as my husband, but as one of our own." Gideon's heart thudded. "Is this what you want?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She looked at him, steady and unflinching. "I didn't ask for this," she said, "but I'm glad it was you." He reached out, taking her hand for the first time. The warmth of her fingers surprised him. Not just soft, but strong. She led him to the fire's edge, and together they placed the final 2 stones. Then Hollow Thorn said his name aloud in the Apache tongue, Shen-Ta, one who walks from shadow. The people repeated it, some smiling, others nodding with respect. Gideon didn't understand the language fully, but he understood the meaning. That night, the fire burned high and steady. Laughter returned to the village. Music danced through the trees. The children chased embers. Someone passed him a carved bowl of stew and clapped his back like an old friend. Talon approached once, eyes narrowed, but instead of challenge, he offered a slow nod. Not approval, but acknowledgement. Then disappeared into the shadows. Later, under the stars, Gideon sat beside Nessa on the ridge above the village, the night cool and still around them. "You know," he said, voice low, "I didn't mean to marry anyone when I gave you that blanket." "I know," she said, "but I'm not sorry I did." She turned to him, the stars reflected in her eyes. "Then maybe," she whispered, "it was always meant for me." They sat in silence after that. And for the first time in years, Gideon didn't feel like a man carrying a life that didn't fit. He felt like a man who'd finally come home. The winter thaw came slow to the valley. Even as spring teased the air with warmer winds and green buds curled along the riverbanks, snow still clung to the shadowed edges of the cliffs. Gideon woke each morning to the scent of wood smoke and wild sage, the cries of birds returning from southern skies, and the steady rhythm of a life he had never imagined himself living. Each day brought work, clearing fields, building traps, tending fires, but none of it felt like labor. It felt like belonging, like breath. The people no longer watched him with caution. Children chased him through the brush, laughing when he played along. Elders nodded when he passed. He had become, in every way that mattered, one of them. But even in peace, echoes lingered. One morning, while repairing a broken fence along the river's edge, Gideon spotted a rider far beyond the tree line. Just a silhouette at first, dust rising beneath the hooves, moving fast. Boone snorted and shifted. Gideon narrowed his eyes. The rider wasn't Apache. He dropped his tools and stepped onto the trail. When the horseman drew near, he recognized the wide-brimmed hat and red scarf before the man even reined in. "Mallory," Gideon said, brushing his hands on his trousers. "Damn good to see you still breathing," the trader said, dismounting with a groan. "I was starting to think the stories were true." "What stories?" Mallory untied a satchel from his saddle and handed it over. "That you'd been taken, or killed, or married into the tribe like some old mountain folk tale." Gideon chuckled, eyes flicking toward the path that led back to the village. "One of those is true." I figured as much when I saw the feather, Mallory said, nodding at the braid Gideon now wore over his shoulder. Thought you'd want this. Gideon opened the satchel. Inside was a folded piece of parchment and a thick envelope. His name, scrawled in a handwriting he hadn't seen in years. It was from his sister in Kansas. He hadn't heard from her since before the war. His hands stiffened slightly as he held the letter, the weight of memories sliding over his shoulders. The past, once so distant, had found its way back. "You all right?" Mallory asked. "Yeah," Gideon said, voice lower now. "Just unexpected." "You thinking of leaving?" Gideon didn't answer right away. He looked out over the river where the water had begun to move freely again. A hawk cried overhead. Somewhere in the village, a child laughed. "I don't know," he said. That night, by the fire, he read the letter aloud to Nessa. "She says her youngest is sick," he said. "Some kind of coughing fever. Doctors can't make sense of it. She's asking if I can come." Nessa listened, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes steady. "I haven't seen her in almost 10 years, Gideon added. "She's your blood," Nessa said. "I don't want to leave you." She was quiet a long time. Then she said, "Then don't." He reached for her hand, rough from work, but still soft against his. "But if you must," she said, "then go knowing you have a place to return to." He squeezed her fingers gently. Over the next few days, the village helped prepare supplies, smoked meat, herbs, a new blanket woven by the women. Even Talon offered a bundle of wild roots with a gruff nod. No one tried to stop him, because they understood something he hadn't, not at first. Home is not a place you hold on to by force. It's a place that waits for you. When the morning came, Boone was saddled and ready. The trail ahead stretched wide and bright under the rising sun. Nessa stood beside him, her hair braided, a string of turquoise beads around her neck, gifts from the elder women. "Do you want me to come with you?" she asked. Gideon looked at her, heart tight in his chest. "I want you with me always. But this journey, it's mine." She nodded. No tears, no pleading, only faith. He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers, breathing in the scent of her skin, smoke, earth, and something wild he couldn't name. "I'll be back," he said. "I know." And then he rode. The trail out of the valley felt different this time, not as foreign, not as hostile. The trees welcomed him like an old friend, and the wind sang songs he now recognized. At night, he camped beneath the stars, staring up at the sky that stretched forever. He thought of his sister, of the child he hadn't met, of the man he had been when he last rode through these hills, angry, lost, afraid to feel too much. And he thought of Nessa, waiting in the place he now called home. He reached Kansas in 6 days. His sister cried when she saw him. Her boy was pale, yes, but still fighting. Gideon stayed for weeks, bringing herbs, building a better stove, even singing to the boy when fever dreams came. Nessa had sent a pouch of crushed leaves that helped with the coughing. Gideon brewed it with honey and watched the child breathe easier. The night the fever broke, Gideon stood on the porch, watching the stars. He didn't need to stay. His family was healing, and he missed the drums. He left 2 days later. This time, his return to the village felt like slipping back into a well-worn coat. Familiar, right. When he rode into the clearing, children ran ahead shouting his name, "Shenta! Shenta!" and Nessa stood by the fire with that same unreadable look. Only this time, when he dismounted, she stepped forward and threw her arms around him. "You came back," she whispered. "I said I would." The village celebrated that night. A second fire was lit. Music rose into the sky. Gideon laughed more than he had in years. He danced, he shared stories, he held Nessa beneath the stars, and as the fire crackled low, he reached into his satchel and pulled something out, A new blanket, not the one he had first given, but one he had made, stitched by hand during quiet nights in Kansas. It wasn't perfect. The edges weren't straight. The thread wobbled. But it was his. He draped it over her shoulders and said, "This time, I know what I'm giving." Nessa smiled, her eyes shining. "And I know what I'm accepting," she said. They stood like that, wrapped in something more than wool, wrapped in the life they had chosen, together. And in the distance, the drums began again, not warnings this time, but welcome, a heartbeat, a home.